Hello everyone, my name is Losare-Lusby, and allow me to introduce myself real quick. I'm a principal open source engineer working at FutureWay Technologies on their Rust team. I've been contributing to the Rust project for coming up on 5 years now in a variety of roles, including a member of the Clippy team, lead of the error handling project group, member of the library team, board member of the Rust Foundation, representing the project, one of 5 members, member of the style team, and a member of the governance working group that wrote the RFC for the new leadership council. And today I'm going to be giving a talk about my life as a Rust project contributor. Now, before I get into the talk itself, I would like to first describe what kind of talk this is going to be, then give a bit of a disclaimer. Starting with this quote, "If we want to connect deeply, we need to be authentic." Oh, okay. Is it working? Here we go. Okay, there we go. Sorry. If we want to connect deeply, we need to be authentic. If we want to be authentic, we need to show up as our whole selves, weak spots and all. If we want to connect deeply, we need to be vulnerable with each other. From Ted Rao. This is going to be a pretty vulnerable talk. I'm going to be talking about my personal experiences working in the Rust project, and there have definitely been some rough spots that have taught me valuable lessons that I'd like to share. Now, the disclaimer, keep in mind, all of this comes from my personal experience, so what I say here won't apply to everyone. Please think critically on whether or not you think any of this advice makes sense for you personally. Now, this isn't my first talk on this general topic. I gave a talk titled Navigating the Rust Open Source Community in 2019. That talk was much more focused on first-time contributors and helping maintainers support and get those first-time contributors engaged. You can think of this talk as a sequel to that talk. And you can find that previous talk in blog form and the video at ya.dev/gettinginvolved. This talk, on the other hand, is going to focus much more on helping people stay involved in the Rust project and in open source in general. You can see we also have this one in written form, if that helps you follow along, at ya.dev/stayinginvolved. So how am I going to approach helping people stay involved in open source? First, I'm going to share an overview of the governance of the Rust project to help you understand how decisions are made and what it's like to work within the Rust project. Then I'm going to share my personal experiences and the lessons I've learned on basically how to maintain my mental health. And then finally, I'm going to go over an example of how I do work currently using the metrics initiative, which is my current project, as the example. So, how does the Rust project work? Here, I'm going to be borrowing from a blog post written by Mara Boss, the lead of the library team, titled "Rust is Not a Company." Now, you're probably familiar with how most companies function. There's an organizational hierarchy with directors and shareholders and other executives at the top of that hierarchy. These groups set goals for the company. They plan how to achieve those goals with things like milestones, targets, deadlines, and they assign that work to the people they manage and track the progress of that work. As a result, most companies function in a top-down manner, where the people at the top have the authority to make decisions for the people that work under them, and primarily what they work on. Now, the Rust project does have an organizational hierarchy. We have the leadership council, and that has sub-teams like the library team, the compiler team, the language team, and they further have sub-teams and project groups. And if you can see more of the structure at rustlang.org/governance. And if you look at the structure, you might think that it works the same way as most companies. But there are some key differences that make it function almost opposite in some regards. Critically, nobody in the Rust project can tell anyone else what to work on. We don't assign each other work. There are no bosses in the Rust project. Leads don't have additional privileges to tell people what to do. What we do have, or teams often have, they publish things like roadmaps, and when we establish project groups, this helps kind of communicate what the priorities of the team are, and they help encourage people to work on specific things. But it's all about encouragement, not command. Teams do have authority. They have the authority to make decisions, such as what features get merged and what features get stabilized, and also who joins the team. But this is done as a group decision. The process for making these group decisions is called consensus or consent, and is often given different names within the Rust project, like an FCP, which stands for final comment period, which will be like the 10-day period during which that decision is kind of being finalized and people can leave comments. And there are processes that use this and other variants of that decision-making process called like the RFC process, request for comment, which is often used for major changes to the library and the language. And there's the MCP process, major change proposal, which is used by the compiler team for smaller changes. And there's the ACP process, which stands for API change proposal, which is used by the library team for more experimental changes. And you can find more information about all of these processes and generally about policies within the Rust project on forge.rustlang.org. I didn't include the link, it's spelled F-O-R-G-E. And specifically, there's the council decision-making document has a general description of decision-making within the Rust project and is a good resource for understanding all of these processes. So all contributors within the project work on essentially a volunteer basis and have full consent over what we work on. Many of us are employed by external companies who may assign us goals to achieve, but we still have to then go and convince other project members and teams to accept this work and consent to those goals in order to actually get anything done. As a result, the Rust project essentially operates bottom up. The leaders in our project act more like shepherds, coordinating work, making sure it all fits together, but they're not really telling people what to do. They have very limited control over how much they can nudge the actual direction of the project. The actual direction of the project is the sum of all the work that's done and all the goals of all of our contributors that are contributing on a day-to-day basis. All right, so with that out of the way, you should hopefully have enough of an understanding of how the project functions to kind of give the context needed to understand what it's like working in the project. So now I'll move on to my personal experience getting involved. My involvement with the Rust project began with Clippy contributions for self-enrichment. I came from a C++ background and had recently fallen in love with Rust, and I wanted to learn to become a better Rust programmer. And so I went and sought out an environment of experts that I could learn from. Around this time is when I discovered Rust meetups. I signed up at the Rust meetup app for the Bay Area Rust Station group, started going to all the meetups. For a while, nothing really came of this. I had a good time. I watched the talks, I ate the food. I maybe talked to one or two people, but I'm really shy, so I mostly just hid in the corner and talked to my coworkers. But after a few months, things really started happening at one particular meetup at Google's office. Now what happened? This is kind of on the slide. Manish, our wonderful meetup organizer, walked up to me out of the blue and unprompted said, "Hey, you're Jane, right?" I was shocked. I was like, how does Manish know who I am? I didn't think anything I had done up to that point was worthy of his notice. And yet here he was, asking for me by name. I replied that I was, and he thanked me for my contributions to Clippy, and told me that if I wanted to do more, to let him know, and that he would be happy to mentor me. This simple act of walking up to me, thanking me for my contributions, and offering to help has had a profound impact on my life. I don't know if I'd have this job, if I'd have gotten as involved in the Rust projects as I did, if I'd be here today, if it weren't for Manish's simple act of outreach that day. In retrospect, I realized I was struggling with imposter syndrome. I had built up these big expectations of what it meant to contribute, to be an open source contributor, and how much work you had to do to be acknowledged as one. I thought my contributions were trivial. I had done things like adding lints. I had changed the test framework so that it warned if the people committed empty files to the repo and cleaned up some empty files. But I didn't realize this is just part of the process. People often start small to understand how contribution works before they get into the bigger work of actually trying to convince someone that some change should actually be included, especially something controversial. Manish's outreach helped me get through this mental block I didn't even realize I had. I cannot emphasize enough how important finding community and making friends is for being successful in open source. Working in open source can be isolating, and you have to actively work to counteract that dynamic to not lose your mind sometimes. Now, meeting Manish wasn't the only thing that happened to me that day, nor the only person who had a big impact on me. Eliza Weissman gave her talk on her library tracing, which I found fascinating and very relevant to my personal and professional code bases. Also, Adam Perry invited me to sit with him and introduced me to Rain and Isabel Marte. Together, all of these people became my first Rust friends. And this is the moment in my mind that I really felt like I became part of the Rust community. I ended up tracking down Manish online before the meetup was even over and sent him a message saying I absolutely wanted to get more involved and for him to help mentor me. And thanks to Manish's support, I did end up taking on bigger changes. I integrated RustFix and Clippy with cargo Clippy -- fix, and eventually joined the Clippy team as a full team member, marking my official start of my membership of the Rust project. My key takeaway for this section is that meetups and conferences like this are an amazing way to get involved and to connect with other members of the Rust community. There are so many amazing Rustaceans that go to these meetups and conferences, so they're a great opportunity to meet and learn from them. And the friends you make at these events will help you achieve far more than you could going alone, and may make all the difference between staying involved or giving up. Now, Clippy wasn't the only Rust I was writing during this period. A majority of my Rust coding was actually spent writing small CLI programs to help me with my day job, where I was writing hypervisor storage virtualization in C++. This is where I ended up becoming particularly passionate about error handling and improving it in Rust. And this work eventually inspired me to establish the error handling project group under the library team. This project group was my first experience in a leadership role, and I view the experience as somewhat a mixed bag. Initially, I had quite a few contributors show up to meetings who were interested in participating, and also the initiative lent me this new sense of credibility within the project, and I think substantially reduced how often I had to deal with the assumption of incompetence working as a woman in open source. But pretty quickly, participation waned, and the project group became essentially a Zulip stream or chat channel and a GitHub repo for organizing issues and discussions. I attribute the decline in the error handling project group partially to my own inexperience in leadership roles. I worry I may have centered my own vision for what I wanted to see in error handling too much and stifled other contributors who wanted to bring their own ideas to the project group. I wonder if people would have stayed involved had I focused more on making space for other people's contributions and less on centering my own. But I don't really know how much of a difference it would have made. Long term, the project group, though no longer actively meeting, did help me complete the move of the error trait into core. Project groups like this are one of those ways that teams can encourage work and nudge the direction of the project. And the existence of the group and my involvement with it kept me engaged. Changes like removing the backtrace function and adding the provider API as a replacement were made easier by the official support that the library team gave me via the project group. And from here, my position as lead of the error handling project group led pretty directly to my deepening involvement within the project. Now, before I move on to the next section of my story, I want to take a moment to talk about the focus of the next section, which is going to be burnout. Working in the Rust project burned me out, and I'm not the only one who has been burned out by the Rust project. Unfortunately, preventing burnout is far easier than recovering from it, so it's critically important that you're aware of the issue if you plan on getting involved in open source. Burnout is a painfully common story in the Rust project and open source in general. You need to be able to protect yourself from burnout and advocate for the people around you, because unfortunately, our current leadership structures within the project are not effective at preventing burnout in our contributors. And in fact, leadership roles are some of the most prone to burnout. So what do I mean by burnout? By the time I recognized I was burned out, I found myself dreading many of the responsibilities I had taken on. Over a couple of years, I went from passionate and excited to exhausted. I'd feel tired just thinking about work, and I'd push through it repeatedly. Every time I drove through that feeling and had a negative experience, that feeling of exhaustion would get stronger and stronger until eventually I couldn't push through it anymore. I think of it as my brain building a wall, brick by brick, to protect me from my work, until eventually the wall was too tall to climb. I had to learn to say no to the work I didn't enjoy when possible, and instead focus on work that interested and energized me. There's a book called Burnout: The Secret to Unlocking the Stress Cycle by Emily Nagoski and Amelia Nagoski that I highly recommend reading on this topic. In it, they define burnout as follows: emotional exhaustion, the fatigue that comes from caring too much for too long. Depersonalization, the depletion of empathy, caring, and compassion. And decreased sense of accomplishment, an unconquerable sense of futility, feeling that nothing you do makes any difference. How did this happen? There's no single event that caused my burnout. There's no single issue that I can confidently say, if you took that away, I wouldn't have burned out. Instead, the buildup of frustrations and negative experiences eventually exceeded my emotional capacity to tolerate them. My progression into burnout looked approximately like this: frustration with RFC and PR review processes and prolonged reviews, taking on additional responsibilities, not because I wanted to or enjoyed the work, but because I felt it was necessary, that someone had to do it and that I was capable. Conflict between the project and the foundation, conflict with another member of the library team, being overwhelmed by the context-switching demands of maintenance and team membership, feeling disconnected from the work and a dwindling motivation, and social isolation. So, almost 1 year after opening the RFC for the error in core, Future Way Technologies hired me to contribute to Rust full-time, paying me for work I'd already been doing as a volunteer. Turning the project into my day job enabled me to engage with the project more deeply than I had before. I clearly remember being frustrated with slow reviews on my work, and I previously declined an invite to the library team because I lacked the time. But now I had plenty of time, so I asked to join, hoping that by joining the team and participating in reviews, I would lighten the load and get faster reviews myself. Unfortunately, this wasn't a very effective strategy. A few months before joining the library team, I accepted the role of Project Director of Collaboration, representing the project on the board of the Rust Foundation. This change quickly catapulted me from a part-time contributor to a reasonably central leadership role within the project. During my 3-year tenure as project director, there were a series of conflicts between the foundation and the project. And as the project director of collaboration, I felt that it was my responsibility to prevent these conflicts, and that I was failing, which ate away at me emotionally. While on the library team, I had a series of conflicts with another team member. We'd frequently end up confused and frustrated by each other, misunderstanding why we had done one thing or another. We brought this conflict to the restorative justice mediator, Andy Eisenson, whom the foundation keeps on retainer to help project members navigate conflicts like this. He was incredibly helpful and insightful and helped me learn some valuable communication skills and repair trust with my teammate. But unfortunately, we concluded that we could not work together due to fundamental differences in how we collaborate. Participating in the library review queue and meetings pushed my ability to context switch to the absolute limit. I had to jump around looking at dozens of PRs and issues in a single day, reviewing massive comment threads and chains of issues to create a picture of the current state of any contribution so I could unblock the discussion and help it move forward or voice any concerns. I did not appreciate at the time how exhausting this would be for me in particular. The flavor of burnout this pressure ended up giving me led me to recognize that I'm not just ADHD, but also autistic, and that I have a high affinity for monotropic focus. For me, it takes far less energy to focus on one topic for an extended period of time than to focus on many topics in that same period of time. I'm still figuring out how to meet this need while participating in maintenance and review roles. Another factor of this was the state of my motivation to work on the Rust project at all. I got into Rust because it solved problems I ran into daily with C++. I got into the Rust project because I wanted to be a better Rust programmer. Problems I encountered in my personal projects, like those little CLI tools, served as motivation for many of my early contributions. For my first few years at FutureWay, however, I worked exclusively on the Rust project and quickly lost interest in doing Rust in my free time, as it was starting to feel like work. Maintenance and governance work quickly ate up almost all of my time, and my personal contribution rate, like how much code I was actually writing myself within the project, dwindled over the years to nearly nothing. This lack of personal frustration with the language created a disconnect that widened over time. My motivation to fix these issues within the language dwindled as the time since I had last been bitten by them grew. It became more challenging over time for me to motivate to support other people who were doing the work to fix these issues. Thankfully, FutureWay has been extremely accommodating. I was able to take a break from the Rust project and work on different projects they were supporting to be able to reconnect with my love for writing Rust. And maybe even more importantly, reconnect with my frustrations with the language and library and my motivation to fix those issues. Social isolation also contributed to my feelings of stress and burnout. For me, it seems that a few hours a day of video calls is not a sufficient substitute for in-person socializing. I miss feeling surrounded by people energized about the project we're working on. I miss being able to take a break when I'm stuck or overstimulated and walk over to a coworker's desk and say, hey, do you want to get some food or do you want to play some pool? This, I think, relates to my ADHD. This need is specifically called body doubling. It's the idea that for some people it's easier to motivate and focus when someone else is in the room, even if you're not actually working on the same thing. There are aspects of remote work that I'm very hesitant to give up. I can't be sure of how much this is just rose-tinted glasses, but I can't help but believe the last time I was truly healthy was pre-pandemic lockdown. My mental health went downhill when I switched to remote work, and I don't think I've ever fully recovered, but I'm planning on moving closer to the office to help address this issue. Now, not everything in this period of time was a source of stress. I participated in the governance working group, which drafted the governance RFC, establishing the Leadership Council, the successor to the core team after its implosion. This group, easily the most effectively run project group I've participated in. Through this work, I got introduced to and fell in love with sociocracy and its model for dynamic self-governance due to its similarities with the governance model of the Rust project. To me, it felt like a formalized version of Rust project's governance. We applied many of these principles to our meetings, including establishing process roles such as secretary and meeting facilitator, which is my favorite role personally. And I've been able to apply much of this governance learning to my personal projects, such as the Error Library, which now has a lively team, which is holding meetings without me being there while I prepare for this conference. A great change of pace from my experience with the error handling project group. During this period, I often got disillusioned that there was nothing I could do to improve the governance dysfunction that I was seeing throughout the project. But the reality is, we have made major improvements, and I've grown a great deal in the process. Ultimately, I ended up taking a break from the Rust project. I realized that I needed a change of environment and to reconstruct my relationship with the Rust project in order to get back to a place where the work was sustainable and enriching for me. I stepped down from all the teams I was in. I did not run for re-election for the foundation. I shifted my focus to recovery, and for that I leaned on my good friend Sophia Turner, who was contracting with FutureWay at the time, working on experimental programming languages. The first language we worked on together was Truffle, an experimental embedded systems program or scripting language for Rust that offers high performance, ease of embedding, and lightweight requirements with a familiar syntax. And after a few months, we moved on to working on June, an experimental safe systems language similar to Rust, which is focused principally on teachability, learnability, and readability, and it's achieving that by experimenting with a novel ownership model. By working on these projects, I was able to get some distance from the negative feelings I'd built up around working on the Rust project and start to properly heal. I got back to what I love, writing Rust code. I got to work with a close friend. Many of our brainstorming sessions would have a casual feeling that really helped me feel a lot less socially isolated. And in this time, I started to feel like myself again. I reconnected with the reasons I got involved in the Rust project in the first place, and I got to utilize a lot of the collaborative skills I'd built up over the last few years occupying leadership positions within the project. Eventually, that contract ended, and I moved back to working on the Rust project, but now with my feet under me and a much better understanding of what kind of environment I need to be healthy and successful. Now I'm engaging with the Rust project very differently. I'm much more hesitant to take on responsibilities, particularly ones I know that I'm not well suited for, at least in the current state. And I'm also sticking to fewer projects and focusing intensely on them. For me, that ideal number of projects seems to be 1. Once I came back, I did have a bit of a rough patch between stopping work on June and figuring out what I wanted to focus on in the Rust project. I knew that I wanted to do contribution work rather than the more kind of emotional and context switching heavy work of maintenance. And I knew I wanted to work closely with someone to get that similar environment I had with Sophia, so I wouldn't feel as isolated, and hopefully so I wouldn't have to wait as long for reviews. I ended up talking to my friend Esteban about this, and he suggested I work on him with the metrics initiative, an idea he's been nursing for years. He had recently written a blog post on the topic and submitted an MCP to the compiler team, which was approved. I was immediately interested. So, this is where I am today. I decided I want to work on the metrics initiative, but how do I go about that? What is my strategy for taking on a new Rust project or a new project as a battle-hardened Rust contributor? Particularly a project like the metrics initiative, which is easily misunderstood. When people hear metrics, what they often hear is telemetry. It conjures images of TCP connections and personal information flying away from their machine through their compiler without their knowledge. And the last thing I want to deal with is a steady stream of users worried about this nightmare scenario. So, first step is get organized. I establish and clearly communicate the foundations for the project. And in this case, that means the motivation and guiding aims, all organized in tracking issue. I'm going to give an overview of this tracking issue, but I recommend checking out the tracking issue itself for full detail, since I'm leaving out a lot of detail in the slides. So here's what the motivation section looks like for the metrics initiative. give 3 main use cases. First, supporting feature development. This is things like answering questions such as if we're working on the new trait solver, we want to understand how does the behavior compare to the old trait solver, being able to log those differences, or being able to help identify and resolve bugs generally. Second, we want to guide improvements to user experience. This is things like compiler errors, knowing which errors people are encountering most frequently, knowing which ones ideally are causing the most problem, and focusing on our improvements on those specific errors. And if we can, being able to identify when our changes have made a positive difference. Finally, we want to improve performance feedback loops and insight. This is things like helping identify pathological edge cases where compiling a certain piece of code takes a particularly long time. And this is actually similar to work that Nicholas Nethercote has done manually in the past. So once we have our motivations, we go on to the aims. This is basically the goals of the project. Our top aim is trust. We do not want to violate the trust of our users. This means a few things. It means no telemetry, no network connections. It means we store metrics locally. It means that user information should never leave the machine in an automated manner. Sharing metrics should always be opt-in, clear, and manual. And it means a minimal retention policy to avoid wasting people's disk space. Our next aim is feedback. We want to provide additional feedback loops to assist in the iterative improvement of the project. This means answering questions about the compiler from real-world production environments in a privacy-preserving way, improving the legibility of rare or intermittent issues, and also to gain earlier warnings on compiler errors, internal compiler errors, users encounter on nightly, so we can catch more issues before they land on stable. Third, we aim to have minimal performance impact. We're trying not to leave any trace. Enabling metrics should not result in a noticeable impact on compilation times. This is particularly important for any metrics we may wish to enable by default in the future. Next aim is extensibility. It should be easy to add new metrics when necessary, though we should only be adding metrics with specific questions in mind, with a well-documented rationale, not just because we think they're cool. Finally, user experience. We want to improve user experience. This means both the experience of using the compiler, as I was talking about earlier in the motivation section, as well as the experience of reporting issues. Hopefully, these metrics will make it easier when opening an issue to give an idea of what's going on. These aims are important because they're the foundation which we want our future discussions to be based on. When people raise objections, we want them to tie them back to the aims of the project. When aims come in conflict, we always pick the higher aims. So as an example, if we had a change which would give us a really good idea of the user experience and the way that people are using the compiler, but does so in a way that completely violates privacy, we're not going to go for it. The trust always trumps the user experience goal. All right, so with all that laid out, it's time to move on to the actual work. I needed to pick an example use case to actually build the whole project around. Like, we have this idea that we want metrics, but what's the first metric that we're gonna get? For this, I ended up talking to a bunch of other project members to ask them what would they like to use metrics for. And I just picked the thing I was most excited about. In this case, that was Amanu's suggestion that we make it possible to track unstable feature usage statistics. This will help teams like Lang and Libs better understand when features or which features are most in demand so they can prioritize their stabilization efforts on those features. It'll help them understand which features are not being used and might not be worth the maintenance burden, so we can remove those features. And it'll help project members see the adoption curves of the features they contribute to help feel the impact of their work. For me, this idea felt like a slam dunk. It felt like something that wouldn't be hard to convince people to, and I'm optimistic that our proposals will be relatively easy and painless moving forward. So this is where I am now. I finished the basic implementation of dumping feature usage and feature statistics information. I took a break from that work to prepare this talk and come to this conference. And when I'm done, I will go back and merge those and move on to the next steps, like building the backend to store metrics and starting to gather or build the ability to gather metrics, such as from publicly available code on crates.io. So that's the talk for the most part. Before I end, I want to just loop back the key takeaways that I hope you get from this talk. First, do not lose sight of why you contribute to the Rust project or open source. The motivation is the fuel for your work, and without it, you may end up burning yourself up instead. Next, remember how the project works. You won't have a manager to assign you work or approve your work, to keep you accountable, or to help you plan. You need to be able to do this for yourself, or ideally with a couple of friends. And on that last note, do not work alone. Make friends, find a mentor, ideally be a mentor. Working in the project can be stressful, and having people to talk to help navigate these situations, or even just blow off some steam, can make all the difference between pushing through and landing a big change and giving up, leaving work incomplete to gather dust. The project is full of some of the most brilliant people I've ever met, and despite my frustrations at times, it's also one of the greatest communities I've ever joined, and I do not regret it for a second. Thank you.